The next speaker is Ms. Sanusha Naidu. She is based at the University of Cape Town. She teaches in the politics department, and she's attached to IGD, the Institute of Global Dialogue, that is at UNISA. Ms. Naidu research area is democratization, development, emerging markets. She has worked quite a number of areas, Fahau and quite a number. So you see how much I know your background. And she is engaged on matters of China. I think she's traveled China quite extensively. And her recent interest is India. She's also even though she's South African Indian, but she has keen interest on India and how India and China are also dealing with Africa. So without wasting time, Sanusha, please, same drill, 15, 20 minutes. And the role is to respond to the two speakers. Thank you. You don't need the presentation, right?
Thank you, David. I think I need a time clock here, so you don't have to stand up on my left. On my right.
I won't, I promise.
Thank you again. I think let me just convey my gratitude to you, Confucius Institute, for inviting me to be part of a very, very interesting dialogue, discussion, and to learn from the two speakers and from the audience. Again, I would like to observe all protocol in terms of the audience, the students, and so forth. I found the two presentations really, really interesting because I think they both kind of complemented each other in the context in which we are debating the idea or the concept of re-globalization. But I was really fascinated by Henry's presentation about what I think is the optics of the narrative. What are we seeing in the media and how that is being portrayed, and how does it influence the narrative in the context of what is real and what is not real, what is conjecture, what is fake news, and so forth. And then how we take that narrative and apply it to the way in which the geopolitics of the world operates. So is it really a trade war? Is it about projecting a branding and an image? But underlying all of this, is it a question of what is the change that we're looking at? And whether or not that change is one that we want to accept. It was quite interesting because I think that the challenge in all of this today is the point that Professor Wang made, and that is the uncertainty of the global landscape. And if there's uncertainty of the global landscape, then how are we dealing with the change that we need to see happen? So let me start off with the optics. I think the optics is something that we assume that what we see in the media is something that is real, but also we tend to accept without questioning or interrogating the information. And that could be a very powerful tool for leaders in how they want to position their countries. What I found interesting in the debates that you raised, Henry, was the questions around power and soft power. And to a large extent, I think it comes back to what Professor Wang is talking about in the context of power and so forth. So really, is it a question of a trade war versus a media war, or is it the question of whether we want to accept that there's something happening in the context of globalization that's producing an uncertainty and instability in the international system where there's exclusion? People are not being part of this globalization process. We are talking about globalization, we're talking about de-globalization, but what does it mean when we say that people need to be integrated, they need to be talking about how they connect, and a very interesting quote by Jack Ma around e-platforms and so forth, that it'll become like electricity and so forth, and whether or not there's a part of the narrative that does not actually talk about people who are excluded from the globalization process. And this brings me to the points that were in the presentation by Professor Wang on the globalization, re-globalization debates around China. What I found fascinating was the characterization of the periods with China's experience on globalization. I thought there was a very good diagrammatic sketch of looking at China's relationship to the global order, but also to globalization. Because one of the things we are saying here is that globalization is not new. We cannot assume that this is a new phenomenon, therefore it comes out only in a particular period. It is an evolving process that starts off, I think, in the context of time, because as the moments that different communities connect on the basis of commercial engagements, we're talking about interaction and globalization of different forms. So whether it's cultural, whether it's political, whether it's economic, and more importantly now, technological. But the other thing that I think we have to, as a sidebar item that I need to mention, is the role or how globalization deals with climate change in that context as well. So I found those three periods fascinating, but what I also found fascinating was the idea that there was an old version of globalization. And that old version of globalization that was characterized in the presentation was one that looked at the deficiencies, that there's a sense that globalization has created particular deficiencies in whether or not the world is integrating in the context of what Thomas Friedman argued the world is flat, or what Professor Hemmermatt disputes, that it's all about optics again. It's what you create as the narrative to say the world is integrating, but really when you look at the numbers, it's not integrating at the fast pace that we think it is. And I think that's a very important point to draw this distinction around this re-globalization and what is it trying to do. The second point in the old version and the deficiencies was the question around the uneven distribution of wealth. And for me, that's the point of departure on the point, in respect of the rules of the game. Because what we really have today is an inequality gap, not just between countries of the developed world and the developing world, or however we want to label it, but an inequality gap that's growing at the national level of many countries. And that inequality gap produces the vulnerabilities of exclusion. So when you think about this question of whether it's a vertical integration or an integration towards some kind of horizontal integration around globalization, I think what we have to ask ourselves is, what are we trying to, what is this re-globalization discussion about? Reform or transformation? If we're reforming the system in terms of the rules, expanding and upgrading the current system, then we're not changing anything. We are just repeating the constant motions of what we have in terms of whether the market is the way to go, whether we need to have some kind of state engagement, or how we try to do that. The second point on the re-globalization debates I think is important to bring back is the question around the rules of the game. What are we transforming in terms of the rules of the game? Because it seems to me that we're continuing with the same patterns, but we're just upgrading those patterns. And what it produces is the very point that Henry made, and that is, how do we get to see people like Trump become leaders, get elected? Why do people vote for them? And to what extent do they actually use the exclusion as the basis of populism for voting? And I think we have to bear that in mind in the context of the globalization and the re-globalization debate. The third point I want to make is around the question of how companies in China are leading the re-globalization debate, or more importantly, how they are the lead actors of China's globalization and re-globalization. Because it was very interesting that you started off with a case study and you ended off with a case study. both in the context of the shipping and the marine industry, and of course now with Alibaba and so forth. And I think those are clear indications that we are entering into a phase where China is moving into what I would characterize a period of a global expansion 2.0. There was a going out strategy in the early 2000s that was very much part of the formal expansion of China. But there's another going out strategy that is much more sophisticated in terms of how it links back to the Belt Road Initiative. And I would actually argue that the Belt Road Initiative is the real re-globalization policy of China. And how do you link that to the question around whether we're seeing a Beijing consensus around this? And these were fascinating debates to draw in around these different discussions that we had on the re-globalization debate. And so what I wanted to ask is, if re-globalization is about legitimacy, certainty, and capacity, isn't it also about inclusion? Because if you don't have inclusion, you're actually recreating vulnerability, and you're actually advancing what a terminology that has come up since 2011 called the precariat. Those that are economically insecure, materially vulnerable, and become completely out of the system, who can then become very much a destabilizer of the system. And I think we're seeing this in many countries in terms of the inequality gap. On the issue of the expansion and so forth, I'd mentioned the contradictions around the rules of the game and so forth. But what I found fascinating was the link to BRI and how the Belt Road Initiative becomes the overarching development program or the development consensus for China in its re-globalization strategy, and where does this fit for Latin America and Africa? In particular for Africa, I think, would we see FOCAC be placed under the Belt Road Initiative, and we'll see a restructuring around that in terms of this becomes the overarching space for us. In terms of the relationship between China and the US, which is a kind of G2 tension in the world and so forth, is the point that was made about a kind of declining Africa policy, or a contradiction in the sense of the US, but of course an increasing footprint for China. And to that end, I'm wondering whether or not we are basically trying to fit these things into the space. Because, within Africa, we've got to also remember that we have to talk about agency. And where does Africa's agency fit in this whole context of discussion and so forth? So in that context, are we trying to talk about it at the geostrategic level, and we're just assuming that these will have differential impacts in different regions of the world? But I think what's also important, and let me end here with one or two points, that if there's this whole discussion around the globalization periods and the deglobalization and what you call the vertical and the involution and so forth, are we not also then creating a situation where instead of an embeddedness, we're creating a disembeddedness around globalization? Because at the end of the day, some countries will globalize faster than others. Some communities and societies will globalize more than others, and there'll be a sense of those that will be disconnected from the system. And this reminds me of something that Antonio Gramsci said in a quote about, and I'm paraphrasing here, and I don't want to basically be very crude in the way that I paraphrase it, but he said, "The old is dying and the new is yet to be born. And in the interim, you have the morbid consequences and symptoms in the international system." And I think we're kind of grappling with that now. And the challenge for us is, are we thinking that, and in terms of the optics of the narrative and the media wars and so forth, are we assuming that China is going to fit into a space and it should actually automatically start shaping those rules of the game? Or is AIIB and BRI the kind of alternative structures to what currently exists. And so you have two spaces within the international system that suddenly start talking about globalization and re-globalization from different kind of push and pull factors. Thank you.